The Holy Roman Empire occupied this territory here. One of the more famous of the kings was Otto, and I'm looking for his name here and I don't see him, so I'm not going to write it down. No, okay, but the one I will write down is Frederick Barbarossa. Actually, before him there was Henry IV. All right, Henry IV is remembered because he took on the church. The church put him under interdict. Now, the church was at this time ruled by Pope Innocent III, the most powerful of all popes. The Pope put his land in any country whose land was under interdict. That meant that any marriage performed by a priest was not valid. There could not be any extreme unction. So basically everybody who died during the time the land was under interdict was lost, eternally lost. And all the other sacraments could not be performed, sins could not be forgiven, or the land was under interdict. So Henry IV went to meet with the Pope and clothed himself with a burlap sack and went barefoot in the snow for 4 days begging an audience with the Pope, which the Pope felt like he finally had to grant and begged forgiveness and was restored. Round one in the conflict between Pope and state went to the Pope. Now later we're going to read where some other Holy Roman Emperor stood up to the Pope and said no. Actually, it was the King of France stood up to the Pope and said no to a Pope and broke the power of the papacy. But right now, at this time, Henry had to bow to the papacy's will, and round one went to the church. Next one was Frederick Barbarossa, or Frederick the Red. Frederick, he was a German, but he spent more time in Italy where he wasn't wanted. And this was a problem that Italy and Germany had. I mean, Italy and Germany remained trying to unite themselves, and a lot of historians say it was an unnatural union. Now, this attempt at unity was to come to a head during World War II when Italy and Germany got together and tried to conquer the world, and they lost fairly miserably. But these emperors were primarily German, but instead of ruling Germany, they would interfere in the affairs of Italy. And the result was they made themselves unpopular in both places. Unpopular in Germany because they were absent so much, unpopular in Italy because they were foreigners. Frederick Barbarossa went on a crusade with Richard and Philip Augustus. He tried swimming in a river with, I believe, he was some heavy armor on, and was drowned, or maybe it was cold water and he got the cramps, whatever, he drowned. And his part of the Holy Roman Empire's part of the crusade came to an end. If Frederick could have lived, and if Philip would have remained with the crusade, they might have been successful. As it was, things went against Europe at this point. Now, there are some less educated people living in the German rural regions of this day who said Frederick Barbarossa is going to come back someday and resume the station that he was started. He's the great king that we're looking for, who is going to lay his crown at Christ's feet when Christ returns. I mean, this may sound like more theology, but if you read any biography of Frederick, they have to mention it, and I read one when I was in graduate school. His plan was to set up the great, great empire that he believed was foretold in the Bible, that would someday, when Christ returned, he would lay the crown of the Holy Roman Emperor at Christ's feet. All right, the next one was his nephew, Frederick II. Yes, I read a biography of Frederick II also. The history book I had in college called him a brilliant failure. I mean, he was smarter than the people of his day. And as it was the case with a lot of smart people, he had a tendency toward liberalism. He did not get along very well with the Pope. Instead of going on a crusade, he sent an embassy to the Muslim world and offered to buy Jerusalem for a large sum of money. And the Muslim world agreed to it. So he bought Jerusalem and said to the Pope, look, I've negotiated a peace treaty. The Pope was very upset. The treaty only lasted 10 years, and then the Islam took Jerusalem back. But for 10 years, Christians did have control of Jerusalem again. As was the case of Frederick I, Frederick II, who was of German, spent his time here in Italy. He fought a war with the Pope, and he lost. But basically, it was a lot his own doing. Here's the story. And even his big admirers have had to condemn him for this. He went on a hunting trip. On a hunting trip, he took all the high nobility with him and all the officers, high officers, with him on a hunting trip and left the enlisted men, the common men, there in camp. On his way back to the hunt, his men started to smell smoke. When he got back to camp, they found that every one of his men had been killed. His whole supplies, his whole army burned up in a big puff of smoke because the men were leaderless. And it's believed that had he been there with the top officers, they could have mounted a fight and fought off the invaders. As it was, the army that invaded found him not there and the top officers not there. And the fact is, he knew the enemy was near, but he just said, I'm going to take off on a hunt anyway. And he did. And as a result, he lost. And from his loss, he never fully recovered. Frederick is also remembered for trying some experiments in science. And one of his more famous experiments was to take 50 orphan babies and give instructions to the nurse that you are not to talk to these babies. I want to see what language they will develop, what language they'll speak if they're not spoken to. And he believed that would be the natural language that man had initially spoke. Folks, there have been several known experiments about the trial like this, and the results have always been the same. All the babies have died. Some of you are nodding your head. If you don't talk to babies, they'll feel like they're isolated, and yes, they do understand more than they can act like. Yes?
Ironically, it's physically possible for a baby to follow an accent. Apparently, at the point where they can hear, they pick up the vocal patterns of people outside. So whoever you're surrounded with is the natural way the child will talk prior to being born.
Oh.
And then it changes with who they're around after that.
But they essentially, though, I mean, everybody, they speak the language that they hear. As far as language folk goes, my own personal theory is that mankind did not invent language. Language was a legacy given to man, the original language, and mankind did not invent it. But then again, that's more theology perhaps than history, I'm sorry. But nevertheless, I don't think humans are capable, because every language is spoken is very complex. Even the language of the most primitive people has complex verb tenses and complex verb forms. There's no such thing as a simple language. I mean, read Edward Rice Burroughs about Tarzan, and he believed that the apes would talk to each other in a very, very rudimentary, simple language. There is no such. All languages are complex, and it's believed by many now that language is a legacy. You know, you inherit the language. I mean, you speak the language you hear, but that language was spoken to their parents, who in turn was spoken to their parents. Anyway, thanks for that input, Brian. All right. Anyway, he did some others. These kings would set up their own universities, and where they collect together a lot of wise men. And sometimes they try to create a race of giants by collecting the tallest people in the realm. But they did not realize that if the height was due to genetics, they might create a group of tall people, 6, 7, and 8 foot tall. But if it was due to pituitary, they didn't know the difference. Sometimes extreme height is due to a malfunctioning pituitary gland, but they would sometimes breed a tall man with a tall woman. But if the tall man was due to genetics and the tall woman due to pituitary, they would not necessarily get tall offspring. But again, this was more than new, but they would try to breed an army of giants, or try sometimes to breed an army of midgets. Peter the Great collected midgets also. But these kings would try all kinds of little experiments that sometimes did not have really great results, and they didn't mind using human guinea pigs. All right. In Eastern Europe, you have the Slavic peoples, but before I get to them,